Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar session. We're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in assessment. This is our webinar series, and this is our first one in the series. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kyndra, if we can go to the next slide. My name is Tong. I am Senior Vice President for Assessment Operations with National Board of Medical Examiners. I'm also the immediate past NCME President. Kyndra, do you want to go next?
Leave myself unmuted. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyndra Middleton. I'm Professor of Educational Psychology at Howard University, and I am also a member on the Board of Directors.
Thank you. Going on to the next slide. So this is, we're kicking off officially our webinar series for this winter. For those of you who were participating in our webinar series last year, we had a webinar series devoted to COVID's impact on assessment practices. At our last session last year, where we spent time discussing what assessment would be like in the near and far future, our panelists essentially discussed the future of assessments within the lens of promoting fairness, equity, and justice. And so we thought it only fitting to devote our webinar series this year to diversity, equity, and inclusion in assessment practices. So today we're kicking off the webinar series with a general session. In the next 3 weeks at exactly the same time, 3:30 Eastern time on Thursdays, we will be having webinars devoted to practices within a certain type of assessment. So you'll see for admission and selections, for licensure certification, and for Q12 student assessment. We believe because of the use of the assessment, the development and implementation processes are very different, and the DEI practices can have different focuses as well. So our goal for the series is to engage our assessment community in this important dialogue. We want to discuss the importance, but most importantly, we want to offer some concrete suggestions and directions on how we can move our practice forward. So without further ado, we would like to introduce our panelists for today. If we can go to the next slide and the next one, Michael.
Good afternoon, I'm Michael Walker. I direct the Center for Research on Validity, Fairness, and Equity in Learning and Assessment at Educational Testing Service, and I was recently elected Vice President of NCME.
Hi, I'm Mike Russell, faculty at Boston College in the Department of Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics, and Assessment.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Sireci from the University of Massachusetts Amhurst. Happy to be here today.
Hey, everyone. Catherine Close, Vice President of Psychometrics at Renaissance. Very excited to be here today.
All right, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. So I'm just going to go over a little housekeeping. So everyone is muted, and if you have a question, please post it in the chat, and we will hold all questions until after our panelists are done, but feel free to post your questions as they come. And the panelists will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present, and then that will be followed by questions. All right, so here are the three major questions that the panelists thought about as they prepared their presentations. How are the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness being addressed in the professional fields that they represent? What are some specific actions their organization or institution or their research agenda has implemented to address diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how has this been informed by or deviated from prior theoretical groundwork? So as Ia mentioned, we are going more from the theoretical underpinnings to more of the what are you doing now? All right, so we will start first with Michael Walker.
Thank you. So I decided, rather than answering these questions directly, to just back up a step and talk about setting the stage for assessment reform. So George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Now, I see that as a warning to all of us in this undertaking. We have to fight against those who would hide the past with the intent of stifling change. Now, the fact is, before you can deal with inequity in assessment, you have to deal with inequity in the classroom. And before you can deal with inequity in the classroom, you have to deal with inequity in society. Next, please. I want to tell you something my daughter experienced when she was 3 years old. Now, the following is excerpted from an essay she wrote when she was 14. "All right, class, grab your markers. We're going to be drawing ourselves today." My tiny preschool hands reached for my box of markers and excitedly dumped them out onto the table. "Remember, class, you can draw yourself any way you want to," my teacher announced. "Let's draw ourselves as different princesses," exclaimed my friend. I picked up my marker and started drawing myself. I drew my butterfly dress and my sparkly Skechers. I drew my curly black hair and brown eyes. But I didn't know how to color my skin. Everyone else in my class was using the peach-colored marker, so I picked it up. As I was drawing, my teacher came over and asked, "Are you sure that's the right color for your skin? It looks a bit light. Maybe you should try this color," she said as she handed me a brown marker. So I started to color in my skin with the brown marker instead, but all my friends turned and stared at me. "Why are you using that marker?" they asked. "It's so dark." I tried to ignore them and finish my drawing. Once I finished, I stared at my drawing. The skin looked weird to me. It blended in with my eyes and stood out against my bright pink dress. It bled through the back of my paper, staining the table brown. I hate my skin tone. Why is it so dark? Why do I have to be different from everyone else? It's so ugly. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. For the rest of the day, I was in an awful mood. When I got in the car, I asked my dad, "Dad, why don't I have peach-colored skin? I want peach-colored skin. Everyone else says my skin is too dark and that peach-colored skin is prettier." My father was shocked. I was already facing this kind of judgment from my peers, and at such an early age, too. He talked to my teachers and talked to my aunt as well. My aunt sent over a book called Princesses of the World, featuring princesses from all over the world, all with varying skin tones. My dad also made sure to tell me stories about people like the Queen of Sheba and the warrior Queen Zenobia, powerful Black women who I could look up to. Society has always deemed those with darker skin inferior to those with pale skin, and even my 3-year-old self was affected by those standards. Next, please. Fortunately, with the communal effort, we were able to help my daughter feel proud of her Afro-Asian heritage. I could see a visible change in her stature and her confidence. And when she was in 1st grade, I wrote her a story celebrating her name and her bloodline, which she displayed to her class with pride. Next, please. Exclusion starts early, and that's why we have to counteract it by fostering greater equity in the classroom. Now, according to Gutierrez, equity has 4 dimensions: access, achievement, identity, and power. Access refers to the resources that provide the student with the opportunity to learn, including quality teachers, facilities, curriculum, and supports. Achievement includes measurable outcomes such as test scores. Identity has to do with the student's opportunity to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. Power concerns who has input on the curriculum and who defines what knowledge even is. Now, Gutierrez sees access and achievement as composing the dominant axis, which maintains the status quo, and identity and power define the critical axis, acknowledging the legitimacy of the student's social and cultural perspectives. Greater control lies along this critical axis and ultimately requires empowering the student with major decisions about multiple aspects of the test and its uses. Now, from where I sit, moving off-center, challenging the status quo has been extremely difficult. Next, please. Now, one lens that helps us to examine this inertia more acutely is found in critical race theory. The critical race theory framework was developed as a way to interpret various government policies. And although there are different variations, 4 propositions appear to be fairly common. First, race is a social construct, not a biological phenomenon. And second, in the United States, racism is the norm, not the exception. The third is the concept of interest conversion. People of color will experience legal advances only when those advances benefit dominant white groups. And finally, the voice of color thesis holds that the people of color know better than anyone else the effects of racism on them, and these personal narratives are themselves evidence. Now, here's an irony. The current surge in legislation banning the teaching of so-called critical race theory in elementary school is pretty convincing support for critical race theory proposition. So what's the point? A critical analysis of how racist forces in the US society operate will provide insights into how to counteract them and to bring about social change. Now, here's one approach. In a recent talk on the future of college admissions test, sociologist Lynn Latukas offers the following guidelines for building a successful movement. Construct a popular frame. Don't be afraid to piggyback off other popular movements. Expanding the domain to include as many people as possible also helps. Use a common condition to which many people can relate. Personalize the problem. Use your vision and your voice to draw people in. Help them relate it to their own personal experience. Simplicity is good. Don't be afraid to use villains when appropriate. Us against them is incredibly effective. And this is how conservative forces have built a movement of resistance against more inclusive teaching. Now, Latuka says that we have to use the same techniques to build an alliance for change. Now, I think this kind of campaign is very important, if for no other reason than to counteract the vitriol coming from the far right. Now, I just finished the most recent edition of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Racist. And in it, he provides evidence for what I have intuitively known, and that is that today we're faced with the shape-shifting racism that makes it hard to identify the culprits or the victims. And what that means is that persuasion campaigns such as Latukas describes will have limited ability to change entrenched attitudes. And that's why I prefer a more personal approach. Now, the way I see it, we need to examine the needs of all test takers and to get their input on how to build better assessments. We need to change how people view and use assessments. And we need to build partnerships with various stakeholders so that we can implement needed changes. Now, I believe that the first step toward empowering others, changing the narrative, and building alliances is the same in each case. Sincere dialogue. I want to ask what others think and feel. I want to listen intently with the goal of learning. I want to try to understand what they're feeling. I don't want to be afraid to share my feelings either. And this process builds trust, and which in turn allows teaching moments. I can explain to others without threatening them why their words or actions might offend someone. And I can respond to negative feedback with a simple and sincere thank you. Now, in this way, one person at a time, I can build a sustainable movement. Now, it might sound daunting, but I gain inspiration from this quote by author and poet laureate Daisaku Ikeda. A great human revolution in just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation, and further can even enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We are going to move on to Mike Russell now.
Great, thank you. You can go to the next slide, please. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Michael, for sharing your daughter's story and for connecting critical race theory to equity. I'd like to take a couple of minutes and try to push us even one step further by shifting our focus from equity, or really inequity, to considering a principal cause of inequity. Over the past few years, an increasing number of journal articles, conference papers, and forums have focused on issues of equity and social justice. As one example, Educational Measurement Issues and Practices recently published an article on social responsibility and college admission testing, along with several commentaries responding to the article. This set of articles was implicitly focused on issues of inequity that result from the use of tests to inform college admission decisions. Many of these articles noted that disparities in test scores contributed to disparities in admission decisions for people membered Black and Latinx. In a few of these articles, race was mentioned. In only 2 of the articles was the word racism printed. Next slide, please. Over the past several years, I found myself reading scholarly work produced by fields outside of educational measurement and educational research more broadly. I've been reading works by sociologists, modern philosophers, folks who work in the field of nursing, among others. What stands out in works published by these scholars is the centering of race and racism. Race and racism is theorized. Racism is examined as a cause of a wide range of disparities in wealth, employment, housing, health, education, criminal justice, and sadly, the list goes on. In these fields, there is a willingness to acknowledge that oppression, and specifically racial oppression, is the cause of these many inequities. Racism is named, and perhaps most importantly, there's an explicit call to combat racism in order to produce equity. For the field of educational measurement to be successful in its quest for equity, we need to step back and deepen our understanding of race and racism. I'm sure all of us are familiar with the phrase, race is a social construct. But how much time have we invested understanding what this really means and what implications this meaning has for the ways in which we incorporate race into our research questions? How we measure race, how we use race as a variable in our analyses, how we interpret and communicate our findings. If race is a social construct, then what are we saying when we speak of the effect of race? Have we thought deeply about why our society constructed race? Have we considered the role racism plays in curating our racialized categories? Is race ethnicity? Is race culture? If each of these terms have different meaning, why is there a tendency for these terms to be used in conjunction and interchangeably? The literature on racism is expansive. The many efforts to theorize racism have introduced a broad range of terms. In the few instances when the term racism appears in our literature base, it is accompanied by qualifiers: institutional racism, structural racism, systemic racism. In my readings, I've noticed that institutional and structural racism are often presented in tandem. Are these forms of racism the same? In our society's more general lexicon, racism often refers to individual thoughts and actions. We speak of overt racism, prejudice, bigotry. There is implicit bias, unconscious racism, aversive racism, microaggressions. We also hear of racism as being ideological. We hear about racist narratives, deficit narratives. Some in our field have begun to speak about white supremacy and white racial framing. We know that several of the founding fathers of our field were central in contributing to the production of scientific racism. How do all these terms and ideas differ? How do they fit together? What is the theory of racism with which our field operates? This figure depicts one model of systemic racism. On the face of it, investing time and mental energy developing or deeply understanding a model of racism may seem tangential at best to the work we do in the field of educational measurement. The theories of greater interest to most of us focus squarely on measurement, statistics, to a lesser extent, cognition and learning. I suggest, however, that in our field, if our field is serious about pivoting to center equity as a foundational pillar of our work, then we need to be willing and able to name racism as one of the several forms of repression we combat. We and the scholarly outlets in which we advance our field need to embrace the topic of racism as being within our scope of interest. And to combat racism, we need to be clear what we mean by racism. Theorizing, developing deep understanding of models of racism are important steps in clarifying our meaning. Theorizing and modeling racism is also essential for us to locate our positions within a system of racism, to understand and acknowledge the various roles we play in sustaining a system of racism, and to identify the ways in which we contribute to the disparate outcomes that system produces. To produce inequity, we must act in our sphere of influence and use our positions of power to disrupt practices and that reproduce the status quo. Knowing our spheres of influence positions us to work with other institutions with which we interact to restructure our compound effects. In short, to produce equity, I believe it is time for us to name racism as one form of oppression we are addressing, for us to interrogate our roles in the system of racism, and for us to muster our power to reform our roles in the system. In closing, I recently heard a story about Tiny Tim and his song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. I wonder if race and racism are the variety of tulips currently growing in our garden. If so, perhaps it's time for us to stop tiptoeing through, or more accurately, around our tulips of race and racism. Thank you. I think you may have to advance a couple times because there's a animation that didn't go. There you go.
Thank you,
Wow,
Mike.
thank you, Michael and Mike. Those are great presentations. And I perhaps have never felt so unqualified to speak to a topic. What I'm going to talk about today has nothing to do with my training in psychometrics. But I'm hoping that, you know, some observations by an old white guy who's trying to understand and navigate the important things that are happening in society and in our field might be helpful. If you don't mind going to the next slide, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm calling the racism reflex. So on the left, you see kind of like typical reflexes that white people have when they're born, and didn't slide in exactly as planned. But when someone says race, a lot of times our reflex is like, race, oh my gosh. Or I think for me, I'm more like the last guy on the right here. It's like my reflex when someone says that's racist or, you know, brings up racism, I'm like, wait a second. I've got like 6 Black friends on Facebook, and last week I went out to lunch with an African American, and you know, if only I can get my Black friends to walk past my house and see my Black Lives Matter flag, then they'll know I'm not racist. And the problem as I see it is this reflex prevents us from listening. If you go to the next slide. So as I kind of have just existed and started to interact with my friends and get into the literature a little bit more, I realized that it's an exciting time because I'm learning a lot. Part of what I'm learning is that I've done and said some really stupid things. Like when someone says that's racist or Steve, you're being racist, it's not that they're saying, you know, I'm intentionally being racist and, you know, I have a secret Ku Klux Klan hat in my closet or something like that. And if I get that reflex reaction out of the way and listen to what they're actually saying, I'll learn some things. So I've got some people on the slide. Kyndra, if you don't mind just hitting through, there's going to be 5 pictures here. So just to share some of the people I've been learning a lot from, you know, Janet Helms, Sylvia Johnson, Jennifer Randall. By the way, you know, she's got a couple of articles that are really getting popular in these conversations, but one additional one was published today that she co-authored with Maria-Elena Oliveri and some others in the journal Educational Assessment on justice-oriented anti-racist validation, which is just another great article. Ezekiel Dixon-Roman and Asa Hilliard, and I have, you know, Google Radiolab Miseducation of Larry P., and you'll see why I now consider Asa Hilliard's work just so important. But if you go to the next slide, let me start with Janet Helms. When I first read her very brief article in American Psychologist, I couldn't get past the first sentence. Here's the first sentence, right? And if you hit the next button one more time, I was like, well, everyone knows that impact is not bias. So I actually couldn't finish the article, but I held on to it. I came back to it. I got halfway through it another time, and I didn't finish it then either. But next slide, please. But eventually I did get through it, and I realized what was preventing me from understanding what she was saying was the racial reflex. Some of the things we're taught about, you know, if your differential predictive validity, you know, looks good, and you know, we're doing our diff studies, and so we can't find a cause for the bias. But actually what she's saying is that race is not a construct relevant variable, right? So if we're saying that these differences are due to racial groups, then our work is not done. So another way to think about it is, how can we be comfortable with our tests when we know a significant proportion of variance in test scores stems not from the color of somebody's skin, but from systemic racism, not the construct measured. It's just one example of the little things I'm starting to learn from listening. Next slide, please. And I just want to point out that I would not have benefited from the new things I'm learning if I didn't have interactions with people like Jennifer Randall, Michael Walker, and others who are different than I am. And I'll add one person to the list that I should have, and that's Darius Taylor, who's a graduate student finishing up here at UMass. I'll invite everyone to Google the Wrong Answer Project. And there's a pretty powerful, just 10-minute video about some of these issues and how people of color feel with respect to educational assessment. So obviously I'm making the observation, I think we should try and avoid our racism reflex and listen and look at some of the older literature that is out there. The article that Jennifer and Milena published today has so many good references in there that I didn't know about, that people have been saying specific examples of how we can do better in educational assessment. But besides listening and learning, what else can we do? Next slide. One thing I think we could do is rephrase our descriptions of equity. So the quote I have here is from the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. We're pretty familiar with this position, and 100% honesty, I helped craft the NCME response to kind of the what was unfolding with the University of California system when they were talking about how the SAT is biased. And the message was kind of like, don't blame the thermometer type of message. So I get that. But I think we have to do more. I don't feel the same way anymore. So if we look at the standards and what they're saying, I think a suggested rephrasing of this kind of acknowledges the point that we might not always be able to prevent adverse impact. If you go to the next slide, please. So the suggested rewrite looks something like this. The first part is, we acknowledge that equality of testing outcomes may not always be possible. So this next sentence is consistent with what the standards currently says. But I think the rewrite has to add something as the following. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Testing agencies should go beyond the tests themselves and work with educators, employers, and other stakeholders to promote equitable systems of education and employment that do not differ in quality or outcomes for students, groups defined by race, ethnicity, culture, and so forth. This is a rewrite that we're recommending in a chapter I've written with Sergio Araneda and Kimberly McEntee. So I know a lot of people looking at this, I'm like, oh my God, this is not our job as psychometricians. Your reflex is kicking in and saying, no, we can't do this. But the truth of the matter is, we are social scientists, and we've learned a lot about methodology and statistics and social science. That remains to be important. However, contemporary society is requiring us to learn some new things. And part of those new things is going to be working with others. So I think we as a community have to engage and rethink how we phrase our descriptions of equity and what we're called to do as psychometricians and educational measurement specialists. The last point I want to make is thank you to NCME for holding this seminar. And for those of you who are not NCME members, join us in this fight. NCME is the best value that you can get in a professional association, $95 a year. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sireci. You can hear me all right? Okay. As I was thinking about what I was going to say for this webinar, I thought I'm super unqualified to talk about the research, and that's why you have Mike, Michael, and Sireci telling you what is actually happening in the world of research. I work at Renaissance Learning as a psychometrician, so I like to think of myself as being in the front lines, sort of like building the plane and flying it at the same time, as Mike Ressa said in our prep call, and that does feel very, very true. So I'm building it, I'm talking to the people actually using the assessments, and I get to hear a lot, but more importantly, I'm a mom of 2 young children, partly my race and a different race all mixed up. So we're all dealing with our identity as new people to this country. And my experience is split between two countries, and I struggle with race because I have two lived experiences, one from my home country and one in the US. And I think race does bring a whole lot to the testing experience. I'll give you an example of when I was trying to go to graduate school and I took the GRE, and the first time I took it, it was such a horrendous experience and I had taken a lot of assessments. So I'm thinking to myself, something is very wrong, but I had not seen a test like the GRE or anything related to that in my entire schooling. So that was a learning experience. And so moving on to the next slide, Kyndra, I'd like to show you what this means to me in terms of a picture. This is borrowed from medium.com. It's some sort of an adaptation of the Giving Tree. And if you think of this tree as a standardized assessment, look at the first three pictures and you can see there's a leaning towards one person. So from the outset, this is not an equal playing field, because the person B with a question mark on top of their head, they're wondering, how do I get access to this assessment? And these are not the things that we tend to see. It's a very oversimplified example, so play along here. This is not what we think about when we're looking at an assessment. We're thinking, well, it's an assessment, everybody's getting the same thing, everybody should have a pretty level, equal playing field, let's take the test. And then the ladders in the second picture give you a sense of, we're going to the same schools, where the teacher is teaching everybody in the classroom the same way. We're getting equal access to the learning. So we should have equal access to show people what we can do with this assessment, this tree. And we start to get there, but you can kind of see person B with their question mark. Is this really for me? Am I really going to be able to show what I know? And chances are that they're not. And then we take it a step further and think, well, person B is really not, showing us what they can do. So let's give them supports. This might be personalized instruction. It might be your accommodations. You're trying to give them access to this assessment, and they start to show us something. But given the amount of work that we've put into this, we're not seeing all of our effort being rewarded that we would like to see it. Person A is definitely doing great. B, not so much. Yeah, they're getting there. So now we don't know what to do. History has been, well, let's classify some subgroups, African-American students as underachievers or English language learners. They struggle, it's just the way it is. We give them everything we can. Nothing is really working. But back to systemic racism, access to things and services and this assessment really, is it the right thing? Are we giving them personalized instruction, all the accommodations, and still not getting there? So maybe we should look at the assessment itself. Maybe there's something about this assessment that doesn't quite speak to all kids in the same way, and they can show us what they can do. So moving on, we know that research has given us some things to think about, but a little bit about history of testing in this country. And I won't belabor this because I think a lot of us on this call do know this. Next slide, Kyndra. I took my short summary straight out of Thorndike. It's a book that I went to school. I learned a lot from in my schooling, and it's sort of a summary of where we've been, 100 years plus of testing, starting with the Binet-Simon scales back in 1905, and the big boom that happened during World War I, where all the AMI alpha and AMI beta tests went through iterative processes of finessing what a standardized test looks like. In the 1950s, of course, we have educational tests everywhere. We have the SATs and the ACTs, and the first standards were published in 1954 under the guidance of APA. It's interesting up to this point, there isn't a whole lot of involvement with the minorities, because if you think about the civil rights movement starting in 1954 through 1968, people are over here fighting for segregation, for rights, for not being segregated, disenfranchised, a lot of stuff happening. And yet on this side, we have this very robust standardized testing movement that's just carrying on. So it's safe to assume up until this point, it's very much aligned with mostly those who went to war, mostly white men, those who could go to college back then, again, also mostly white men, mostly. And so those are the people sitting at the table. That's the representation. Those are the assessments that you're getting. And then Sireci will tell you, and I'm not just saying it because he was one of the panel members, but standardization has not, has not really been the level playing field that we would want it to be. A lot has remained the same in over 100 years of testing, perhaps with only the exception of students with disabilities and English language learners who we've started to think about a lot more. If you have a disability, that's not anything that anybody can deny. So we start to think maybe we should do something there. English language learners, there was a time when English was the only language of instruction. And now we're starting, or we have taken measures to really get in the classroom and teach them and also assess them in different languages. So, but mostly because there have been legislative laws put in place to make us do these things. And I'm not saying that we need to have a law mandating us as psychometricians to go out and think about race and the effect on standardized testing, but it is a thing that we do recognize potentially impacting a lot of our students who do not have access to assessments as they should be. Moving on to what our tests look like today. Again, not a whole lot has changed. As psychometricians, we tend to lump our work into 3 buckets. Content development, we write all the items, define our constructs, and we've gotten really fancy. We talk about universal test design, so this assessment is accessible to everybody that needs it. We go on to the psychometric analysis. We feed all these fancy IRT models. We check for bias, the sensitivity review of the item. So this item is not offending anybody. We do the diff studies by race and gender. We're doing all of the things that honestly, I think are great to do. And then we move on to test administration, and we have some very strict guidelines about how this test is to be administered with fidelity. So somebody doesn't have better access than others, or they get, preferential treatment that could potentially bias our scores. Key is comparability. We want these scores to be comparable across all of our students. However, in light of DEI, moving on to the next slide, we started to think a little bit about what that test development cycle looks like. As we're getting more, getting re-familiarized with culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive assessments, it's becoming very clear to us that it's not just us as psychometricians, the teachers also need to be doing their work. So gone are the days where you approached your students and lumped them into racial categories and probably ignored a bunch of them that you didn't share anything in common. Now our teachers are being called to actually come in and think holistically about the students that are teaching. As psychometricians, our tests have been put under scrutiny. Well, we're not seeing ourselves represented in this. And if you don't see yourself represented in something, it's very hard to stay engaged and motivated to take those tests. We have had people write assessments for everybody without representation in the room. Let's bring everybody together. Let's bring some cultural experience into the test writing practice so we can better understand the different nuances that I couldn't write, for instance, for another race. Accommodations and accessibilities, big. Not just for students with disabilities and English learners, but also starting to think about expanding that a little bit outside of those 2 subgroups. Maybe alternative ways of demonstrating achievement. Maybe this one standardized test isn't the thing for everybody. I have 2 kids. One of them loves assessment. They could do it all day. The other one would rather take my trash out, which I think is a worst job than take an assessment. That's how strongly she feels about him. So while we're all approaching assessments differently, I think it's best to understand what our students need. And on that same breath, starting to do user experience and asking students how they feel about the assessment, showing them examples for their reaction, just getting the student experience, which we haven't really focused on a lot. And then at the same time, we're also getting a lot of pushback from the field. Some people want it, some people don't want it. So our newly redesigned assessment that's going to be culturally responsive and engaging is probably not a very welcome thing in a whole lot of some places. That's not what they want. Others really want that. So we're sort of getting pulled in all sorts of different directions based on where we need to go next with our DEI efforts. And to summarize, I think it's clear the way we conceptualize and operationalize our assessments today, we're sort of leaving some students behind, because I don't think everybody who represents the heterogeneity that we have in our student population today is at the table when we're talking about these assessments. 100 years of the same thing, same processes, a few minor tweaks here and there, and we're not there yet. I think we have a lot of work to do. Rita Pearson is one of my favorite TED Talks, and she believes every kid deserves a champion, and I believe in the same thing too. And if we want to be champions for all of our students, we need to really start thinking about how we create our assessments that are truly providing a level playing field for all of our students. And this is such a generous session on everything, and I work more on K-12 CAT. So I'm anxious to hear what everybody else is thinking along licensure and admissions to college and universities on how we could use DEI to make our assessments better for everybody. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Catherine, and thank you to our other panelists, Michael, Mike, and Steve. Thank you as well. I feel like this was a great kind of preview into what's coming up the next 3 weeks. And I think I saw a question or a comment in the chat about what can we do. So this panel was more so the general panel to kind of get you thinking. And next week, we will focus on a specific topic, and then the following week and the following week. And we are focused more on what organizations and companies are actually doing. So I'm excited to hear what's coming next. Yeah, do we have any questions in the chat that you could ask?
I just saw one just come in directed at Catherine about Catherine, if you could talk a little bit about balancing the clinical utility of test items with the potential bias in the item. And there's a specific call out about assessment language.
Oh, assessments of language. When you talk about clinical utility of tests, what are we thinking? I would like a little bit more information on the clinical part, because we create assessments for use in the classroom, and ours are more of universal screening and progress monitoring and that kind of thing. So I think a clinical test would be somebody else along licensure and certification. Unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise.
Any other members any other panelists want to weigh in? Or we can move on to the next one. I'm glad to see you're thinking it's an exciting time for psychometricians. Thank you for that comment.
If not, while we wait, I do have a question actually for the panelists. So what do you think has been the most difficult hurdle to overcome in assessment when considering DEI, since we, Catherine, you did mention, you feel like you're kind of pulled, like some people welcome it, some don't. So what's been the most difficult hurdle in this work?
I think it's been mostly acknowledging the fact that there exists inequity, because it's a social construct. And, every time you bring up CRT, you can kind of see how everybody just tenses up. You want to call me a racist? I don't think so. I've done a whole lot of good stuff, and a lot of people are doing great by kids. But I think it's just the whole concept, I think, has been received more of, we're accusing a certain race of being racist. So I think it's the dialogue that we need to have around, you're not a racist. It's more of the way assessments are conceptualized. They're not really accessible to every child in this country in the same way, and maybe with more tangibles. For instance, we're doing all of this work, you're putting a whole lot of resources into educating our kids, and yet we still have a whole lot of minority kids getting lumped into remedial classes or groupings that don't help them advance to where we want them to be. So I think the dialogue is more of us starting to show a little bit of what we say, instead of just umbrella terms of racism and all of that. I think it's the dialogue for the most part.
Anyone else wants to respond to that?
For me, one of the most difficult hurdles to overcome, okay, let's think about this. I think it's going to be hard for educational institutions to rethink how they use assessment information. If they're just using it to put people into boxes, then they're missing its value, I think. I think it's going to be difficult to get testing professionals to relinquish some of the power that they exert in testing to the people who are being tested. But I think it's going to be most difficult to enact policy changes that will actually open up the educational and assessment space to make it more inclusive. And I think policy really is going to be very key to this. I mean, just look at the kinds of laws that are being enacted to prevent teaching of so-called critical race theory in schools now. If you start to make tests that reflect a more inclusive agenda, then there's going to be a lot of pushback.
Thank you. All right. If no one else has a comment, yeah, I think I saw a couple questions coming in.
Yeah, we do have some questions coming up. There is a more theory question that Andrew is posting, and specifically asking if Mike, you would respond to that. I don't know if you have a chance to look at his question around APA recent resolution, the apology comment there.
Yeah, I saw his question, and yeah, I'm very familiar with that. I'm actually working on a project with the American Psychoanalytic Association, where they're engaged in an analysis of their work. And there's many within that commission who are hoping that they will be producing a similar apology. It's obviously very political, so who knows what's going to happen. I think there's, as I said in my comments, I think there's tremendous value in us stepping back and thinking very deeply and critically about both the roles that we play in racism and producing and reproducing inequities. But I think also, to Catherine's comment just a second ago, also getting clear on what we mean by some of these terms. When we use the term racist, well, what are we referring to there? In sociology, some people distinguish between racialisms versus racist. And that distinction is, in sociology, it's very important, because it kind of speaks to what Steve was talking about, where we have these ideas that have been put into us, the racialisms, and just because they exist in us and influence doesn't make us racist. However, the actions we can take can have racialized impacts. So figuring out what our terms are and what our meanings are, I think is an important step to moving towards, what Steve's saying, trying to get rid of this reflex. And to Andrew's comment, I think it's really important for a field to do exactly what APA did. I think we need to be honest, and until you can acknowledge where we sit in this system, we can't. I don't see how we can combat the system.
Yeah, if I can just add on to what Mike is saying, NCME is a learning community. So the pushback against critical race theory is like, yeah, we don't want to teach this stuff. NCME is exactly the opposite. We're embracing the conversation, and I think that's important. For those of you not familiar with the APA statement, they basically apologize for the role APA placed in perpetuating systemic racism in American society. And they called out specifically testing in several of their whereas proclamations. So for that reason, I think NCME probably should chime in, either endorse the statement or do something similar, because admitting that we have been, if not part of the problem, at least not doing enough to combat against the problem, is the first step into making reparations and to improving things. Personally, I didn't know about the dark side of the testing history. I mean, when I learned about testing history, and when I taught testing history, it was, oh, Alfred Brené, what a nice guy he was. He developed these tests to help, make sure that no one would be denied education in Paris. But, there's the whole eugenics part. There's a lot that we're now starting to learn. And I think by educating ourselves, we're going to have just a better picture that will result in not just better tests, but better assessment practices, particularly the role of educational tests, not just as like policing and credentialing, but in actually helping students learn, all students.
Thank you, Steve, for that comment. And just to piggyback on your comment around NCME as an organization should also discuss our role and discuss APA's apology and where we as an organization should also be able to do. I do want to share that the NCME board has looked through not only that apology as well as the American Black psychologist's response to the APA's apology, and we've had some ongoing conversations, but would certainly welcome any feedback from the membership in terms of our responses, just to share on that. But I'm seeing a lot of traffic in the chats, and I think this is a topic that we all agree that is very important. And I also see some chats where people are talking about it's important, we understand it's important, but then as practitioners, what are the things that we can do? So I think as a community together, I think it's important for us to embrace it together. We're at the very beginning of this journey, and it's okay if we don't have all the answers. It's important that we want to take on the journey, and it's important that we want to share our answers and try to grow together. And that's why we're putting the webinar series together, is just to provide some ideas so we can take on the journey together. Anyway, Kyndra, do you have another question you want to ask, or are we going through the chat?
Yes, I saw one in the chat that's to all of the panelists, and it says, how far do you think we are to having a consensus about best practices relative to DEI and assessment practices?
I love that question. I think we may never have a consensus, but I think, making progress is important. Mike Russell and I have talked a little bit about how it's hard to publish some things sometimes if you're going against the grain. But the fact that we've got the special issue he pointed out, and the special issue of educational assessment that came out today and so forth, means we're starting to get some momentum, and we're starting to bring more people in the way we should, just to have the conversation and to educate one another. We might not always agree on everything, but we should agree on some fundamental principles about equity and inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, Steve, I'd like to just share a thought too, and I know this may rub people the wrong way. There's been a lot of focus recently on modifying particularly items and tasks and passages. There's a comment earlier about having representation and how important that is. And it is. I'm not suggesting any of that work should not be done. We should be investing more in that. But, Michael referenced Eduardo Bonilla Silva earlier. And, my conversations with Eduardo, he always tells me that I focus on the individual. I'm always trying to change individuals. And he says, you can change all the individuals you want. But that's not going to solve the problem. The problem is not about individuals. And so I think we need to make sure that the work that we're doing to improve our instrumentation, our items, is also coupled with efforts to try to think about the system, the structures, and that that as test developers, as testing organizations, that we try to make connections with other institutions with which we interact to try to make changes on policies and practices of how our instruments are being used. Because it's not the instruments are problematic in that they are providing less valid information and inferences about certain groups of people. But what is really harmful is the way in which our instruments are being used, given that there may be these lower levels of validity for certain groups of people. And it's those uses that are really problematic, are creating equities and perpetuating inequities over time. So unless we partner with those users, we can do all these improvements that we want. It's going to have an impact, but it's not going to solve the larger problem as I see it.
And of course, I think we've also seen this from the chats too, like for practitioners, the assessments are ongoing. People are using assessments for important decisions. And some we endorse, some we may not endorse, but people use them the way they want to use them anyway. And so there are some fundamental responsibilities, and then where do those responsibilities really reside? I think a lot of it we're all grappling with as measurement professionals, but at the same time, practitioners are building tests. What are the things we can do now versus what are the things that we can do in the future once the framework is more in place? I think that's where we are. Catherine was building the airplane while we're flying it as a phrase, and sometimes I think it does feel that way where we are. But Sue, I do agree with Sue. It's an exciting time for us, and there may be some opportunities for us to make some real impact, real differences. Anyway, Kyndra, sorry I interrupted.
That's okay. Yeah. That was perfect because what you said about the plane. So for those of you who are in the testing industry, I think this is a question for you, and along those lines. What do you feel, have your views changed, now that you're doing the work, say over the past 3 years or 5 years, like, have they changed? Have they shifted? Have they remained the same?
Yeah, I'll respond to that briefly. So actually my views changed in the last 2 years. And I think first I took on this new role at ETS directing the Center for Equity, and that was at the end of 2019. And then in this position, I really see myself as an advocate for potential test takers. And it's somewhat, but it's not entirely different from what I felt my role was as a psychometrician on several testing programs long before that. But perhaps the most striking influencer was the 2019 AERA presidential address by Amy Stewart Wells, not the address itself, which I had serious issues with. In particular, as an educator, Wells did not bother to investigate her own role in perpetuating educational inequity. She just pointed her finger at testing. No, but what really did it was the theatrical piece that preceded that address. It was called Overdrive. The piece was written and performed by Epic Next Theater Ensemble, which is based in New York. And these young people of color began by interviewing about 36 stakeholders involved in standardized assessments. And then they created a piece that illustrated many of the difficulties young people of color face with respect to testing. And it's on YouTube. So please look up 2019 AERA presidential address, watch it, and see what it does for you, because it did a lot for me.
Catherine, do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, I do. Actually, mine has always been I've always been in a state of conflict since I came to this country to go to graduate school because of my experiences. So I grew up in a country where everybody looks like me. Race wasn't really an issue. I didn't have those experiences. And then I got to the United States, and obviously I was so blind to it all. I just muscled my way through life without a lot of thinking until I started going to AERA and NCME. And incidentally, Kyndra was the first person that I got acquainted with so well. And we start talking about our experiences, and I realized there's a whole world of lived experiences that I wasn't a part of. So I have been on a journey to try and educate myself so I'm not offensive. You know, this whole statement, well, you get the same experience as everybody else, how come some people can do it and others can't, is so distractive. You're not paying attention to where people are coming from and what their lived experiences have been and what obstacles they've been able to overcome to get to where they are. And so for me, it's super important that we keep that dialogue alive in front and center in our assessments so everybody gets equal access.
That's fabulous. I think I can relate to part of your story, especially at the beginning too, growing up in a different country, then moved to a different country, and all the cultural elements and racist elements that you have to live through. I'm a practitioner as well, and I can say for the roles I've been in and in the past 2-3 years, I think I not only just myself, but I also see practitioners in the field are a lot more conscientiously about how their approaches to building assessments, and really think about how we can really not just have a checklist of, yep, we've done item by sensitivity reviews, yep, we've done those beautiful diff analysis, and then we're done, right? It's not just about a specific point in time and be done with it, versus we really need to approach this more conscientiously. So I see a lot more conscientious approach and care, and be thoughtful and planful around putting it together. And of course, there's some very specific examples about, for example, with the medical exams that we built, we would be thinking about what patient characteristics we want to really put into our scenarios for the medical students to respond to, so we can be more inclusive. There are a lot of conscientious efforts in those places, and of course we're very far away from the ideal stage, but I think those steps are very necessary. And I do agree with Mike Russell's point about we need to have the framework. We really need to have the theoretical foundation instead of just bits and pieces trying to fix it. But I feel like from where I stand, I think it's important to do both right now, because we don't really we need to approach it in both ways and get to an ideal place.
Yeah, so yeah, if I might follow back on what you said, you know, I've built assessments for 40 years in, you know, vocational assessments, intelligence assessments, and achievement assessments. So I've got a broader perspective. But I think honestly, the note Michael talked about being impacted most recently by, you know, George Floyd's murder and the focus and attention on DEI in general. Honestly, I think back, and there were pretty strong mile markers all along that we had issues with equity. And maybe because I grew up being white privileged, I didn't notice them at the time, but I look back at milestones, and I remember one in 99 or 2000 where it was a court case, and I just went through, you know, the body of evidence that we had sensitivity and review committees and considered in earnest all the items and all the data, and felt good about the evidence I presented. And the judge, who was of Hispanic origin, said to me That's great. Are there any items in your item pool where the Hispanic population outperforms the white? I said, no, not one. He says, don't you think that's a problem? That has haunted me since then, because it's clear to me that that's a problem. But yet our procedures and practices seem to find that acceptable as long as we go through the process. So I've spent a lot of time last 3 years second guessing my decisions and judgments about equity in the assessments we build. And I concur with Steve Sireci's comments that this is a perfect forum to have challenging discussions, because we are a research scientist community, and we may or may not come to agreement on what we ought to do translating our research and our science to society. But I think if you look deep down, you know, there are probably mile markers like I have that y'all have. So I thought I'd just add that because it kind of piggybacked on what you were saying.
Yeah, can I follow up on, oh, Steve, you had your hand up, so why don't you go?
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Mike.
I just want to follow up on what John was just sharing, and kind of share my own experience. So Randy Bennett in the comment was talking about, you know, reading a lot of that early work, and that's actually what's got me moving down this path. Is I was preparing a seminar in 2015, and I was reading that work, and I was like, wow, I wasn't really aware of just, you know, I'd read Stephen Gould's book, but, you know, I didn't just see it there in the words, just changed my thinking. And while I said in my chat comment that I don't think very many of us actually hold those ideas today, but the way in which any field begins then influences what happens, and it starts to become almost habits. So in part what John was describing becomes a habit of the field. And so one of the things I've been doing is thinking about the habits that I have, and particularly the assumptions that I'm operating with, and trying to always challenge those assumptions and say, if we weren't already doing this, how do we do it? And so an example I have is, again, in diff. I've been doing some work around intersectional approaches to looking at diff. And, you know, one of the comments that keep coming back is, well, you're not really doing a diff study, you're just doing a diff analysis. You should be looking at the items and identifying da-da-da. And it's gotten me to think, well, what if we change the question when we're actually looking at the item, so that we're not looking for a reason for diff, but instead saying that is, what explains the difference? If we can't explain the difference, we can't find something that's biased, then we're going to keep the item. What we see, and Steve, and you partially wrote this in your response to California, is this, you know, this logic that, well, if we can't find it, we know that there's just inequities and opportunity, and those inequity and opportunities very well can be explaining it. And if it is, then it's legitimate. It's a valid difference in performance that's a product of learning. So if that's part of our logic, then we should, when we're looking at us, we should be looking at reasons for why the diff is occurring, not. And if we can't justify it, then maybe we should be removing all those items. It's a different way of thinking it, but I'm not suggesting that's the right way. But it's like a way of saying, let's challenge our assumptions, let's ask questions differently, and think about, well, is that going to change our practice, and is that going to improve our practices and help address inequities?
Yeah, thank you. Before I say what I think is so important, I just want to acknowledge my privilege on the podium and just pause for a minute and invite anyone who is holding on to a comment, who's particularly from an underrepresented group, might want to say something. Okay, silence has always been an enemy to me. So with respect to what have I learned in the past 2 years, have I learned anything? I would say a lot. I would say my views have really changed a lot in the past couple of years. And one reason I already mentioned is Darius Taylor, who's an African-American student at UMass. We haven't had a lot of African-American students. I haven't had a lot of African-American colleagues. I grew up on Long Island, where I didn't see Black people for most of my life until I went away. So if you look at the video posted for the Wrong Answer Project, Darius is talking about a professor who's saying some pretty racist things, and that professor is me. So when I realized that perspective of what I was teaching about how it's really hard for tests to be unbiased, it really opened my eyes a little bit. And it's only because we started to have more diverse student body here. The other thing was Bill de Blasio. When they started talking about the problems with the high school admissions test in New York, only 9 African Americans got into a class of 1,000. I'm like, all right, I don't care what your differential predictive validity results say. You can't tell me there's only 9 talented African American students who deserve to be in that high school. So it really started to make me think about things differently. And then we had, the SAT, ACT issue in California, and now we have the New York City lawsuit that the New York City Department of Education has violated human rights of minoritized students related to high school admissions testing and other assessments. So I think just living and breathing in society, Michael mentioned how things are changing with the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, requires us to not only think differently, but to learn more. And it's only, like, I just want to repeat this, it's only because I've had interactions with people who've had minoritized experiences that have changed my thoughts. And I really am appreciative to my students and colleagues for that, because I'm starting to learn more.
Thank you, Steve. I think I see one question that I had to scroll up for. So this is, it says 2 questions actually related to culture and inclusion. What is the role of intersectionality? For instance, I wear different hats. I'm a male, ELL, immigrant, Latino, and many others. What is the role of bias as we move forward to make tests more culturally inclusive and sensitive?
I'll answer briefly. So this is one of the things that I've been complaining about for a long time. We mentioned diff a few times, and people mentioned in the chat. So, and traditionally we have our pretty much politically defined racial ethnic groups plus male female, and we look at them to decide whether particular items are functioning differentially against different groups. But what we don't really look at is intersectionality. So and so I think it's essential that we do. I also think, unfortunately, that diff is just this is probably going to be heresy to my other psychometrician friends. Diff is pretty much played out as a psychometric method for really looking for bias and test. I think it's way too crude at this point. I'm not saying that it wasn't a good thing when it was implemented. I think it was absolutely the right thing to implement at the time, but now we need to look for something better. And what I suggested in a brief chat message was that we really need to back way up and start to just interview people, just talk to them and say, okay, so what do you think of our tests? That's a first step. But really, we need to start thinking, examining other people from different cultures, different socio-cultural backgrounds, and finding out how to even learn, like how do they express themselves? And so, because what happens is we have these tests that really are looking at things from a single viewpoint. And this is something that Jennifer Randall pointed out in a recent 2021 article, that we try and make everything the same in the name of standardization. But what that does is that really eliminates the viewpoints of many people. And so they just can't even react to that test. So we need to back way up and ask people, how do you express yourself? What are the funds of knowledge you bring to the table? How can we utilize those funds of knowledge to help you better express what you know and can do? And how can we be open to the possibility that there may be more than one correct answer, right? There's more than one correct way to do things, and allow those things to, I don't know what else to say, qualify as showing your competence or capabilities.
I see a hand up, Michael Rodriguez.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to jump in real quick. Really appreciate everybody being here, and I'm glad to see that there are lots of participants. It speaks well to how this weighs so heavily on so many of us, especially those of us that have found NCME to be our home and our professional home. And it really is important. I do also want to broaden the conversation a little bit. A few folks have mentioned this idea, and that is those of us that are on the test development side, the psychometric side, the vendor side, the side of higher ed training folks to do this work, oftentimes are stuck a little bit in the position of reacting to something that others have already done. So the real example here that I want to get to is definitions of the construct and the content domain, academic performance, academic content standards, for example. Oftentimes, we come into the picture in the test development and assessment development stage being given the standards. This is what needs to be covered. This is what you need to measure in terms of what people know and can do. And to some extent, we can still play a role because we functionally operationalize that. But oftentimes there are core limitations in terms of what we're allowed to put on the test, because of course we're so much darn concerned about that alignment to the standards. And if it's not in the standards, it can't be on the test. And we have a lot of work to do in terms of defining what it is we care about knowing about people and about what folks know and can do, and the constructs and the way those are defined. And there's been some discussion in the literature about this most recently by some of the members that are on this call already. And I wish that those of us that think so much about assessment development had a bigger role in those earlier steps around defining what it is we care about knowing and what's relevant and important to know. So I just want to put that on the table as well.
Michael, that's a great example of what I'm trying to encourage us as a field to do, right? That's an institution talking to another institution and us trying to have influence over that. And that's the kind of work that I think we need to be doing at a kind of a meso level.
I don't think I see any more questions right now. Any comments?
Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in either. I think maybe we can just give our panelists to see if there's any closing remarks they want to do. This certainly has been a very, very active session, and probably a little bit uncomfortable at times for some of us or all of us in some degree. And it's important that we conquer that uncomfort and be able to talk about it and be able to move forward together. But I'm going to see if our panelists want to have any closing remarks for a bit, and then we can close out the session if we don't see any other questions coming in.
I can go first. I think for me, the excitement that is people doing research in this area and us starting to think about assessments in slightly reimagined ways is fun, you know. When you start to think about racism and the fact that, you know, I loved Sireci's reaction slides to this term. It's a very common reaction. People don't want to go there. It's uncomfortable, but we're doing research on it. We're writing it down. We're naming it. We're starting to really have conversations around it instead of denying that it doesn't exist. And I think that's a very healthy step towards getting to the next level of whatever our future assessments will look like. So I'm super excited about it.
I'd like to take a moment, if I could, just to tell a quick story to illustrate what I think is when I talk about learning moments. And I really believe that something we can do in our everyday life outside of academia or testing organizations, just talk to people. So in a former life, I worked in a factory. I was making electrical components, and one of my coworkers was a woman named Doris. Now, this was in the South, and Doris understood Southern hierarchy. So here's how she introduced herself to me. She said, "I'm what you call poor white trash." So she knew the hierarchy. And Doris and I worked side by side together, and we ate lunch together, and I went to the company softball games to cheer her on. So one day we're working in the factory in the shop, and I needed a razor blade so I could finish something I was working on. So I said to Doris, "Hey, Doris, slip me that blade, will you?" And she dropped her screwdriver. She blurted out, "Quit talking like an N-word." And I was dumbfounded. I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, and repeated herself. And she must have seen that look of incredulousness on my face, because she felt compelled to explain, "Michael, I don't think of you as Black, so don't talk like that." And evidently, the way Doris found to accept me without upsetting her schema was to pretend that I was not exactly one of her kind, but not one of them either. Now, here was a good teaching moment, because I could have blown up and cussed her out, and I could probably have gotten her fired if I wanted to, but I liked Doris, and I wanted us, truly to learn to understand each other. So I said, "Doris, if you don't think of me as Black, you don't think of me, because I'm Black. I was born Black. I will die Black. And you know what? I really like being Black." And she didn't say too much for the rest of the day after that, but I could see her thinking about it. And I can't remember if she ever apologized or not. It doesn't matter. But I think she was forced to humanize Black people in a new way, to the point that later, when she was challenged by a white friend of hers for hanging out with me, and the N-word, as he called me, she cussed that man out, and then she told me about it. So I think those kinds of interactions can really help us to forge alliances among ordinary people, and to change one by one the attitudes of people who would look at us as outsiders or someone inferior to themselves.
Steve, Michael, Mike Russell, any parting words before we close up?
How could I add anything to that? I mean, Michael, thank you, and Catherine, just incredible. If I do a principal components analysis on what was said today, I think what we come up with is listen, talk, and collaborate. And as Catherine was saying, we're going to have to be uncomfortable. These conversations are uncomfortable. As I continue to have these conversations, I'm going to say some stupid things that offend people, and I don't mean to, but I think we're going to have to get through those bumps to make progress. And again, I'm just really glad that NCME is forcing us to have these conversations. Some people today might walk away being uncomfortable or frustrated, but like Michael's story, use that as fuel to help us learn. And I think that's one way how we'll move forward the most quickly.
I see a raised hand, Dave Johnson.
I wanted to go back to Michael Walker's last story. I'm confused. You said that she understood the racial hierarchy where you were. So where did she place herself in that racial hierarchy? Did she place herself above you, or below you?
Oh, definitely above me. So in terms of, so here's how it is in the South. You have rich white folks, and then you have poor working class white folks, and then you have everybody else. So she was definitely above me, and it's the kind of added. And actually, if you want to read about it, read Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Races. He talks about some of this. So when it comes down to it all, no matter how bad off poor white folks in the South are, they're like, at least I'm not Black. So she was definitely above me. But I think she learned to humanize me, and we formed a pretty good friendship. And I'm pleased about that. Yeah.
I know a different expression, and forgive, but there's a expression from years ago, which was, "I'd rather be a nigger than poor white trash." So I was confused when you said that she knew the racial hierarchy, because the way I understood it is poor white trash saw themselves below Black people in the South.
No, not in my neighborhood. But I'll have to look that up. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you.
You know, this conversation is reminding me of the eugenics movement. Like, where do we order these groups along the scale? You know, they're so silly. But thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you, David. Mike Russell, I think you have the parting words.
I really don't have anything more to say. I think it's all been said, and like Steve and others, I think NCME for hosting this series of sessions.
I want to thank everybody for participating, and Kyndra, I'm gonna pass it on to you to close us out. But it certainly has been a great session, and I appreciate all the active participation from all of us. Kyndra.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone again for attending and for such a rich discussion. And I'm really excited about what's to come. So please be sure to join us over the next 3 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.